now. Welcome, Pastor CeCee Mills, to One Community Lutheran Campus Ministry. Thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So I currently serve as the Associate Director for Evangelical Mission for the North Carolina Synod. And our area for our synod is the whole state. Some synods are a city, but because there are about 200 churches in the whole state that are ELCA, so we cover the whole synod. And my main role is to help congregations to think about shared ministry. So whether it's two smaller congregations thinking of sharing, or a larger congregation willing to share with a smaller congregation, or have an intern together through two congregations or more. Some of my sites are looking at having 4 or 5 churches cooperating together. And I help them to look at where they've been and discern where they're going. Where is God calling us to be in mission? Figuring out if they're a vital congregation. I give them the good news that over 80% of congregations are worshiping 50 or less in mainline denominations. So if you're worshiping around that number or a little smaller, then you're probably normal. And they're able to see that God still has plans for them. And so we work together to think about how those 2 or more congregations can work together. Other parts of my portfolio include helping with the multicultural and diversity aspect of our state. And so helping the staff figure out how that fits into their work, as well as working with individual leaders to help with training. We did an anti-racism training, so doing a lot of work with that. We also have an African descent strategy team. The ELCA has a national African descent strategy. So each synod should have a team that's helping to live out that strategy. And so I also work closely with that team. And we're really excited because this year we launched in COVID a racial justice network that helps those who are ready and mature enough to kind of dig into their anti-racism journey. And so we do all types of events. Some of them are art, we have spoken word, music. Sometimes we have leaders that come in who share something on a particular aspect. Lamont Wells, who was also my seminary classmate, came and he shared with us about reparations. It's something that we are beginning to think about and probably will bring forward at our next Synod Council meeting, well, actually first Synod Council meeting in 2021. And so I do that work. And then on the side, I do a host of other things. Because of my passion for racial justice, I get invited a lot of places across denominational lines, sometimes non-denominational lines, to offer workshops, lead conversations, or to help people to kind of see how does that fit into their mission. I think a lot of that comes from just my heart, how I was raised as a child, my expectation that the world would be diverse and loving, and that everybody would love each other and be good to each other. Because of the church I grew up in Greensboro, called Prince of Peace Lutheran Church, as well as most of my childhood was pretty diverse. There were dominant cultures in African descent and European descent, but there were also Haitians and Puerto Ricans and other people. And I just thought that's how the world was and should be, and that it would be warm and welcoming. So I had those experiences. And so my current call, it's unique that this particular position exists because there's also a director of evangelical mission, and both of us are part-time. And normally there's only one person full-time that does all the stuff that I do, plus a host of other things. And this synod listened to my sense of call that I wanted to work with congregations, not just, come in and meet with them twice a year, but to really accompany them. So my position is really about walking alongside and helping congregations do that in an in-depth way. So as we look at these relationships, they last longer. So it was about 3 years ago, I told the bishop what I felt called to do. And he's like, yeah, we don't have anything like that. We've had to downsize because of finances. I really can't do anything. And then he spent about a year later, chasing me to ask me to come on to staff. And so I'm excited to be able to live into that sense of call that I have now. I've always had a heart for people. My mother always taught me that no one is better than another person. We're different. So even in physical attractiveness, just because one person finds you attractive doesn't mean the next person will, and that's okay, because everybody has a right to their opinion. So if someone didn't like my personality or my physical appearance, I didn't take it personally. I just thought it was a matter of taste. So I'm not confident, but I'm okay with someone being displeased with who I am or what I'm about. And I have that same patience for them. I want them to be authentically who they are. So as I shared, I grew up in that congregation that was biracial. It also started out as a children's center. So I preached my first sermon at age 9 because the children weren't the church of the future. They were the current church. And so I was able to do that and experiment with all different roles in church. But it wasn't until much later, when I was in my late 20s, that I discerned a call to public ministry. I was working for the Postal Service as a shop steward. That's a person that helps the union by representing cases for individuals who have a complaint against the agreement that management has made with the units, called a collective bargaining agreement. And so I got to represent them, which I thought I was going to be a lawyer when I was younger. So it gave me a chance to kind of, do cases and cite precedents and do all of that. But the biggest thing was that it gave me a chance to have one-on-one conversations with people. And inevitably, it turned to matters of faith. And then that spilled over so that those people were calling me at home. And I really felt like I would rather do that than work. So I could work 12 hours at the Postal Service during Christmas rush and still have energy and capacity to talk with someone or to pray with them. They also saw me at my desk with my Bible. I always had my Bible open because we were keying on the computer. It was just when the mail was switching from being manually sorted to being sorted by the computer. And we were the in-between for the ones the computer couldn't read, then we would finalize them. So there was no mail in the facility where I worked, just computers. And because of that, we took ergonomic breaks every hour. And so I would keep my Bible open there. And so people would come and ask me questions. And that just kind of just made me feel like, yeah, I would love to do that. And I went out to lunch with the director for Evangelical Mission at the time to talk about my home congregation and some things that were going on there. And he said, well, have you ever thought about, going into public ministry? I said, now that you mention it, I do feel that sense of call. So I've already been preaching and been very active in my congregation. And now this other aspect of the one-to-one pastoral care aspect, I was like, yeah, definitely. And he said, well, after you retire from the Postal Service, remember, I'm in my late 20s at this point. He said, after you retire from the Postal Service, maybe you can do that. And I'm like, ah. But thankfully, he connected me with the Senate office, and the Senate staff, who knew me my whole life, said, well, of course you would be a pastor. We knew that, a long time ago. So we're glad that you finally came around to it. And so that was how I felt my call and was able to live it out through people who encouraged and strengthened me, as well as the experiences and the ability to experiment that I had early in life. And so I was excited about that. The worst treatment that I ever received in regards to racism did happen after I entered the call process for the ELCA. After the Senate seemed so excited that I wanted to go into full-time ministry and very supportive financially, emotionally, and naming the gifts, I had to wait 2 years to get my first call. I was assigned to North Carolina, and they tried to find a congregation that might be open to having a woman who was also African descent, and were not successful. So what happens is the bishops will talk with one another in the same region. So Region 9 is our region. So the bishop at the time, Bishop Bolick, talked to Bishop Mooney in the Virginia Synod, and Hank Boshin, this gentleman I went out to lunch with, who was also a director for Evangelical Mission, suggested that I go and help with this new mission development, new-ish, it was 7 years old, I found out, and go and work with them. And their founding pastor had just left, and they had just been organized the year before. And so Hank had every confidence in me. Bishop Monty was like, she looks like a little girl. I don't think she can do this. This is hard. So he believed in me. By then I was in my early 30s, and I came to Rejoice Lutheran Church in Chesapeake for my first call. I served there. I found out that there was misinformation. So I was under the impression they were worshiping about 75. And then I learned years later that they probably were worshiping more like 25 when the founding mission developer left. And so we gave it the old college try, so to speak, and discerned that our season had ended, that we had made a good effort. We had trained a lot of leaders that would not have been trained in other churches, people with severe poverty, people with mental disabilities. We had some that were not going to be allowed, I don't think, to read in normal congregations, but in our setting, as long as you were willing, then we allowed you. And again, I think that came from the church that I grew up in, that allowed that holy experimentation. Everyone participated. So it wasn't just the good readers or, you know, the people who could sing the best. Everybody was invited to experiment and to praise and lead in our worship. And so then after I served there, I was invited by another mission developer to work part-time with his congregation, who was trying to reach out to their community. They were predominantly European descent, and the neighborhood was about 50-50 with European and African descent. And so they invited me in to come and help them with their outreach, because he had heard about all the things that I was doing at my other congregation. And that was really fun, because he was a friend of mine. And it was a congregation we could really push, and we could really encourage them to meet their neighbors. The funniest thing we found out was that most of the neighbors didn't even see the church. It was very heavy pedestrian traffic, but they walked by without even seeing it. It had just become a part of the landscape. And then after that, I spent another 2 years waiting for a call before I was called part-time to work with the church-wide organization at the African Descent Ministries desk. And throughout those different seasons, I did a lot of interviews with different congregations. Legally, churches can discriminate. They can discriminate against women and people of color and people in LGBTQ legally. Theologically, we're not supposed to do that. But because of that, congregations felt emboldened to tell me that, yeah, you're nice, yes, you preach well, but we couldn't call you here because we would lose a whole lot of families because you're African descent or because you're a woman. And they said that to my face. And I'm sure there were worse things said behind my back. There was one interim here in North Carolina that the DEM thought I was perfect for, and the congregation bucked so hard that he got angry, and nothing ever angered him, that he got angry and was shocked that they would say that. And I shared with him, I experience it all the time. That and people asking me the question as though I represent all African descent people. Why do Black people do this? Or what do Black people think about that? Especially like in pericope study groups with other pastors. There's an assumption that I have this female African descent point of view that speaks for all women and people of African descent. And so those were like the things that hurt me the most with racism, because these were people I loved and whom understood God in the same way that I did, who kept saying things that were hurtful and harmful. One of the many questions we often get asked as people of color is, what brought you to the Lutheran Church? And I always respond, I don't understand your question. But I do understand that question. The question is, you're a Black person in a predominantly white denomination. You must have been Baptist or something. So how did you end up here? And the truth of it is that I'm a 4th generation Lutheran, that my family's heritage goes back to my mother's grandmother, and that they were Missouri Synod. They built an LCA church a block away from my home. So that's when we crossed over to the bright side. But you know, there's this assumption that there's more different from us than it may be or may not be. And the other part that bothers me about that, what if I did come from a different tradition? So what? So what? If I'm here, you should be excited and not investigative. So dealing with all of that, I don't think hard skin is the proper way to describe what people of color have to do. They have to be dualistic. They have to take those things that are microaggressions as well as outright racist things and deal with them in such a way, sadly, as not to offend the offender. It's the way our society works. It puts us in that horrible position to have to do that. And so you have to live in this dual identity, this dual way of being. So it's always good to be able to just speak earnestly with people who are hoping to build relationship and learn things and to grow in their own sense of knowing people from other contexts or cultures or ethnicities. So a lot of the things that I do these days outside of my work include things that help people to have those conversations. Sometimes I think we want to jump to, well, what do we do? What's the solution? How can we fix racism? And the biggest thing is to get to know your neighbors who don't look like you. Have authentic relationships where you're not going to them with a list of questions just to ask them the questions, but you're actually curious and want to get to know them. And then celebrate the ways that you're alike and the ways that you are different.
Yeah, man.
That was a lot, I know.
I'm wondering if anybody has questions for CeCee at this point.
I do. So you made a really great statement about people asking, you know, how you feel offended when they ask you what brought you to the Lutheran church. Sorry, I just got an email. Anyway, I know, knowing like the church that I'm a member of, we are rural, we are white, we are ELCA, but we are on the conservative side of ELCA. And I know if somebody asked me that question, I know I wouldn't be offended. Obviously, we are of different backgrounds. And I know if you came to my church, somebody would probably ask you that, but I know they wouldn't mean what you would think that meant. And so I guess like, how could we ask you a question like that to get to know you spiritually without offending you?
So Liz, I'm going to ask you this. How many times have you been asked that question?
I haven't been to too many churches, but usually it's, how did you find our church? Why, something along that line. Yeah.
Right. So how many times have you been asked, how did you become Lutheran?
A few times, actually, yes.
A few times. Like how many? Like 5, 10?
Probably less than 5.
Yeah. So I've been asked that probably 100.
Okay.
So it's not a relational question. It's an information gathering question.
Mm-hmm.
And I always encourage people to ask relational questions. So the relational question starts off, why am I asking? Do I want to get to know you? Or am I just curious because you look different than I do? And the reason I get asked that question is because I'm African descent.
Okay.
I mean, that should not be, hi, how are you? Not welcome to our church. Are you sure you're at the right church? Did you want the Baptist church? Because I do a lot of pop-ins because of the nature of my work. So I go to different churches and I go in like a mystery shopper is what I call it, because everybody thinks they're warm and inviting. So that is one of the things about privilege is you have to understand it doesn't matter why that question offends a person of color. Just don't do it. It's the same thing that I warn when I ever do my diversity trainings. Don't touch a Black woman's hair. Just don't. just don't. Even if you're curious and you want to know what the texture is like, just resist the urge. Tie your hands behind your back, because there's no way to unring that first impression. And so the way to ask that question is through relationship. So even if it stays at the back, that's okay if you feel the curiosity, but get to know that person. Think about the kind of questions that you would ask someone. Let's say you were volunteering for something, you just happen to get paired with someone who was also from your same culture. what types of things would you ask them first? Probably things like, are you in school? What year are you? What's your major? You know, those type of things. So relationship questions that may be getting at the surface. And then using active listening. Active listening means you are hearing the person. You are not thinking, oh, I'm going to share this next. All you're doing is trying to absorb what they're saying. And then you respond with questions that dig a little deeper. So let's say you ask me, well, is your family originally from Greensboro? And I shared that, and I began talking about my grandfather, which I call Pop Pop, and my eyes got teary. You would dig into that part. You would say, oh, tell me more about your grandfather. I want to hear more about Pop Pop. And so eventually you would get to the place where I probably would share of my own free will that, you know, my family had that heritage where they were part of the Missouri Synod Church. I would tell you about my grandaunt who used to get my bulletins and put them in the face of the people in Manhattan at her Lutheran church who were Missouri Synod. Tell them, this is from a real pastor. I'm like, no, they don't recognize women. Don't do that. So story is always a good way to get at some of those details by letting the person kind of talk about themselves. But it's really important not to ask. I have 3 nephews whose mom is biracial. My dad is African descent, and her mom, my dad's second wife, was European descent. And then their father had Japanese and African descent heritage. So they look like we are the world children. And people will say, what are they? And that's just another horrible question. So the curiosity is what is their heritage that made them look like that? But that's an offensive question. It's an earnest curiosity question, but it only should be asked after there's a relationship. And if you knew their last name was Musanaga, you probably would say, oh, they must have some Japanese heritage there somewhere. But it's about building relationship and recognizing the difference between curiosity questions. If you think about going to the zoo and the things that you would ask the zookeeper about the animals, if that's how you're treating a human being, you might want to back off to those questions. Is it just because you're curious to know more, or is it because you want to build a relationship with that person? Good question though, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you.
You had mentioned you were working with a congregation that you knew you could push. How do you know whether or not you can or should push a congregation, and how far you can push them, especially in terms of challenging racial perspectives?
Yeah, that's also relationship. When you talk to the congregation and you watch how they react to ordinary decisions and minor choices where there is pushback. One congregation I went to, and I asked them to introduce themselves, to tell me how long they had been there, what positions they've held at their congregation, and then if they could be an M&M, what kind of M&M would they be, what kind and color? And their answer to my question was they introduced themselves and said, I hate change, all of them. It was 12 people there, 11 of them said, I hate change. Change is my biggest fear. And I was like, did I ask that question? That told me, strangely enough, that they knew they had to change, that they had come to that realization. They didn't like it, but they knew that they had to, which is better than people who say, oh yeah, we're real adaptable. We've been the same way for the last 50 years, but we change in a minute. That's not realistic. So getting to know them and to do that, as well as in my pastoral role as interim, I can challenge them in ways that a called pastor can't. So I could ask them for things that were slightly unreasonable and to see how they responded to that. I could also find out about the community. I would ask them questions about, so who are your neighbors? Who's in the community? And a lot of times they will tell me how the neighborhood used to be European descent and that it's changed. And there are more people of color, but they don't come to church and they don't know why. And so that gives me some insight that they're not used to having relationship with people of color because they're afraid of, what do I say to them? How do I connect with them? It seemed like a foreign idea to them to think about having that relationship. So usually there are some context clues the biggest way to learn how far you can push a congregation, though I hate to say it, is to push them with something that's minor and just watch how they respond to it. So one congregation I went to, and what I did was I had them take me on a tour of the building. It's a nice building. I had gone in the nursery the day before when I was in there alone, and there was probably a 1/4 inch of dust on everything. So if I were a stranger coming into that room, I would think children have not been here for years. So they're not ready for me to bring my children. And the reason I went in there is because we were about to have a clothing giveaway and welcome my neighbors into the building. And they had told me how they stand outside in line for an hour before we open the doors. I said, well, this is our chance to show hospitality. And so then I took them on a tour, and I asked them as we went in a different room, what does this room say to our neighbor? If only the room could speak, if you're not there to tell the neighbor. And so we went into the nursery and we saw the visible dust. That they saw, oh yeah, I could see how that says that. They said the crib is broken. I said, so if a neighbor came in with a baby, you couldn't put them in the crib because you're not ready. And so I didn't come there for 2 weeks. And 2 weeks later when I came, they had cleaned and taken away the furniture that was old and broken. They had replaced it with things. And so I could tell they're ready to change. If I can give them just, I said, we're not doing anything right now. I just want you to walk through the building and see what your neighbor sees. And they immediately addressed it. So that told me they're ready to go with whatever I had to throw at them, that they would be ready to go. They would plan, they would respond, and they would be willing to shift how they had done things for the sake of their neighbor. Good question.
That makes me think, CeCee, about trust that's built in relationships too. When you can just sort of poke and push each other a little bit, then you can learn to trust each other along that process, and that can break down the barriers that we and people before us have put up in terms of those relationships. That's really helpful.
A lot of times church people will try to be respectful and not push each other. So they will try to, I don't want to upset the apple cart, I don't want to hurt someone's feelings, so they will try not to do that. They will not hold each other accountable or encourage each other where they see opportunities for growth. And we're not doing God any favors by doing that. And we're not doing our neighbors any favors by doing that. So it's helpful to kind of see how we can help that person to see. One thing, you tell them when they're amazing too. So you give both compliments and encouragement and accountability. And that tends to work where I see it happening. I think a lot of people wonder the most of where do I begin when they talk about doing something that's going to increase their ability to become an anti-racist. And the first block, it has to be your inner circle. So if you think about your friends, who are your closest friends? Who are the people that you relate to? If that's monochromatic, then you have work to do. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person or you're doing anything wrong. Most of us stay around people that we're comfortable with, but it takes some intentional work to get out of your comfort zone and to build relationships with people who are not like you. It's the only way to create authentic change. A lot of churches will say, well, we want more people of color. What do we need to do for them to come to us? And so they'll get like drums or something else that they think is a superficial change, that suddenly the people of color will come and feel welcome and at home. And the truth of it is just build the relationship. There are many African descent people who like nosebleed high church, who love organs, who, so it's assumptions that we make about each other that just aren't true. And so it's better to get to know individuals and build relationships with them. When you get used to doing that in an authentic way, people of color will see that and feel more comfortable. Other questions?
I have a question. You mentioned that you gave your first sermon when you were 9 years old, and I'm wondering if you remember what that was like and if you knew then that you wanted to be involved with the church for your job.
So I love being at church. I was not thinking about being a pastor. If the church doors were open, I was there. When I got to be a teenager and I could, travel on my own, my best friend was Baptist, and we would be at her youth group. When we got to be young adults, we would go to choir concerts, extra worship services. I was just really a church head. At 9, I remember having the conversation with my pastor, who's Erling Miller. She's the first African descent female ordained in the Lutheran tradition in America. And she was my pastor. I didn't know it was a big deal. I just thought, she's my pastor. And it was her first year with us. And we didn't have youth groups that were the age cutoff because we started as a children's center. So we had 3 different young people groups, but at age 9, I was already in one of them. And at the youth group, someone had suggested that I do the sermon, and Pastor Erlene had said, yeah, why couldn't CeCee do it? So I remember sitting in her office, her giving me these books and telling me different things about the text and I don't remember the text or what I said. It wasn't until I was 12 that I did a sermon that I remembered. And the title of it, I was so thrilled with the title, was Are You Ready? And I had this whole rhythm and run that I was going to do at the end after I had preached, asking, are you ready for what God is calling you to do or to be? You could be a teacher. Are you ready? You could be a singer. Are you ready? And I was just saying, I said, I could be a pastor. Am I ready for what God is calling? That's the deeper question. Are you ready? Then my church, for the next whatever many years, ran with, CeCee said she's going to be a pastor. And I was like, no, that's not what I said. At that time, I imagined that I was going to be an immigration lawyer. We had Haitian refugees that lived on site. Someone had donated a house to us, and we actually housed Haitian refugees who were working towards citizenship in that house. And so that's what I saw myself. I thought I would work for the church, but in a legal way, not necessarily in the pastoral ministry.
My question has to do with current climate and really just how you're doing. There's a lot at stake right now in the US and in the church and in individual lives. So today, how are you doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when George Floyd was murdered, a lot of my friends reached out to me because we do have authentic relationships where they can say the hard things. With me, there are no dumb questions. I would rather you ask an offensive question to me and I respond in an honest way so that you don't keep perpetuating that particular trauma for someone of color than anything else. And so we have candid discussions. But when George Floyd, I've never watched the whole video because I can't. I just can't. I've seen enough in real life that I can't watch it. I can't watch it. So one of my friends, who's actually the person that was my contact person for candidacy, reached out to me and asked me, what are we going to do? And I was thinking, for the last 2 years, I've been leading an anti-racism training that teaches you what to do. You already should know what to do, is what I was thinking. I didn't respond that way. But I said, I don't know what you're going to do. That's your work. And so she heard that, and I left it there. And I felt like I had left her in limbo. So like 2 days later, I checked in with her, and she had found like 5 things that she could work on. I have a really good rapport also with the Senate staff. I'm the only person of color on Senate staff. And Haley can tell you, I was the only rostered leader of color for many years in the Virginia Senate. But we were talking about it, and I just talked about the level of exhaustion, because the shocking reality that the rest of the world saw was the painful reality that most people of color have been living in for years. It was not a surprise to us that people were dying in police custody in an unjustified and undignified way, in an unnecessary way. We knew that was happening. We know that a lot of the cases don't make the news because it's not a priority. Also, if the victim has drugs on them, or the victim had a criminal record, then it was suddenly justified. Oh, they're criminal. And we're aware of how normal behavior is criminalized in Black and Brown communities. So the reason they have a criminal hit record is because it was intentionally done to them. When I was in high school, we got bused over to the historically white high school. I was supposed to go to a high school that was like 50-50, which is what my educational experience had been: European descent and African descent, with some Native Americans and Latinx and some immigrants from Africa. But when I went to high school, they decided to send us. So it was probably 80-some% European descent. And we were sent over to there to be a part of that community. And I remember that the first day I went to my AG English class, and the teacher asked me, was I in the right class 3 times? And I said yes, and I just turned around. I knew he wanted my name so he could check his roll, but he was going to have to ask me that. I wasn't going to just, give up that information. And eventually he did ask, my name, and I told him, and he told me I was in the right place, as though, I didn't know that I was there. So that experience of being mistreated and looked down upon was something that we knew, being assumed to be a criminal and all of that. So when that happened, and the response was that it was exhausting, having to help people that were close to me realize the pain and the trauma that we felt, every day, and watching that death and everything. So when the Senate staff started to talk about it, I just said, I have no hope. I have no hope that anything is going to change. I think that this is kind of like a firecracker, that there's this big explosion, there are lots of lights, and it will fade away like the end of the 4th of July. And things will continue, that there won't be any substantive change, because it will just go by the wayside. And I felt like the reason why it received the amount of attention that it did is because COVID had us fixated on the TV. And so everybody watched it, and there was no explaining it away, because there were over 8 minutes right in front of us of a man dying, of him crying, of him saying, please don't kill me, crying out for his mother, and all of those things were right there. So it seemed undeniable. And then I get to this week, and I'm like, yeah, this is why I didn't really have a lot of hope. It's because I know for a lot of people, keeping the status quo is more important than me or my son dying. I know that that's true, that it's more important that their way of life be protected, whether it's for monetary reasons, whether they think it's somehow helping with anti-abortion work, or whatever they think it is, however they rationalize, it says that someone dying, someone being killed, either by police or by someone else, simply because their defense is, I was afraid. They can say they were afraid, even if it's an irrational fear that's grounded in the systemic racism that's a part of our culture and a part of our society, that they can justify it. So that even though the election looks like it's moving in a different direction, we have a lot of conservative voters here who are Lutherans, who really strongly supported Trump, who are going to be very, very upset and disheveled because they won't know what to do. But I keep thinking, your life's not in danger. If President Trump doesn't get elected, what are the things that you're going to lose? Is it going to be your civil rights? Is it going to be your right to breathe? Why couldn't you see that as something important enough to ask President Trump to do those things in the way that some people around him that had influence did? Why wouldn't that be a priority? Why would you not challenge him when he said racism isn't really in America anymore? Why wouldn't you do something about that? I don't care if you have conservative values and you want to vote Republican for the rest of your life, or if you have Democrat values. The same thing can be said about a lot of Democrats who are often supported by people of color. I don't see them taking strong stances in a way that would that would greatly impact people of color's lives. It has to be a whole lot more than what we're doing. And I think there's a fear of upsetting people in churches and in society. There's a fear of upsetting people by facing the realities that people of color, the trauma that they face, and they deal with it. One more thing, Amber Ruffin, she is a sister of one of my pastor friends. So she is on Seth, why can't I say his name? Seth Myers. Thank you, Seth Myers. Worked with Seth Myers as a writer. And after Donald Trump won the first election, she did a segment called Join the Fun. And, you know, a lot of the liberals were just in a state of just grief and just distraught, and they couldn't believe it. And she was saying, yeah, welcome to our world. This is what we've been dealing with all this time. So join the fun. And he's like, it's not fun. She's like, it's not fun. But the recognition that, you know, that some of those values, specifically his friendship with so many hate organizations and thinking they're just good people, to me has nothing to do with Republican values. So, I think I went off on a tangent or 6.
That was really helpful. My question is kind of related to that. I've been seeing kind of like 2 narratives in social media lately, a lot related to their perception of people who support Trump and Republican values. And one of them I see is a lot like, if you're friends or if you vote for Trump, like, I can't be friends with you. I can't listen to you. I don't like you, even if you think you're my friend. And there's another side I hear a lot. It's like, no matter what happens or no matter what you believe, like, we can still love each other and respect each other. And I personally, like, I think about both of those things and I agree with both of them and I disagree with both of them. And I'm just wondering how you hope people approach kind of that whole problem or that whole relationship. Because as you just said, and I agree with, I think it's so hard to rationalize people who vote for someone who endorses such hate. But they're still people. And so I don't know. It's been something I struggle with.
You're way ahead of the game, Rachel. I teach that all the time in my diversity trainings. I try to be nonpartisan. I try to share that my understanding of the gospel, if there's any place where you should be able to have healthy relationships with opposing viewpoints, it should be in the church. It should not be a taboo thing in the church. We should not be endorsing any particular candidate or way of thinking. We should be teaching and preaching, proclaiming, and following the gospel. And so the gospel teaches us that we are not meant to say that this person is bad. Further, if you're a Biden supporter and you demonize Trump, you're helping to keep racism in its place. Because what you're doing is you're taking a person, you're reducing them to specific actions that person has done and dismissing them whole out, plus their supporters. Creating a type, a group of people is what racism is. And if you do it even against racists, you're helping to feed the racism machine, as long as you keep a we and a they. So you have to have the patience to speak with people who might not be like-minded. Here in North Carolina, one of the groups that I spoke to was in an area of the state where the Daughters of the Confederacy have these ridiculously huge Confederate flags that flank a city. And so this group, it's a group of pastors and lay people, decided to come together to try to get those flags removed. And well, I shouldn't say they came together for that. They were coming together to have conversation every month, and that became a hill that they decided to climb. And so when I came in and I did a training on implicit bias, I asked them what their starting point was. And they said, well, we've been talking. We had to find out who owned it. And I said, did you talk to them? And they said, no, we didn't really think about that. They thought about, getting petitions, appealing to the local government, even though it's private property, the government can't do anything about it. And I said, did you go and have a cup of coffee with them and ask them what excites them about their heritage, that they want to share it in that way? Did you go and listen to them to see why they believe what they believe? What do they believe? Because a lot of people I know who have Confederate flags will say that they're not racist. They say that their family heritage, they're celebrating their ancestors or something else. So did you go and have that conversation? Go and have that conversation without the agenda of getting rid of the flag. Until you can see your neighbor as a person, there's little chance that you're going to be able to convince them to take it down. There was an African descent man, Daryl, and I can't remember his last name. He went around and just talked to Klansmen. That was what he wanted, to go and listen. So they said some of the most god-awful, hateful things about why they believe what they believe. The fact that they didn't believe that African descent people were people and how they're the superior race. And they said all of these things. He collected, I think, like 7 of the hoods sets from Grand Dragons, who are a hierarchy of the Ku Klux Klan, who later left the Ku Klux Klan because of the relationship that he brokered with them. He did not go in there to try to convince them what they were doing was wrong. He went in with genuine curiosity to listen, and then to allow them to get to know him. And I think inevitably they saw him as a person with intellect, with a heart, with a family, with a love of the country. Even though they may not love everything about the country, it doesn't mean that they hate the country. And so I think that that's a big thing for us to learn, especially if we call ourselves disciples of Jesus Christ, is to learn to go and seek a relationship with those who offend us the most, to go and have conversation with them and listen earnestly, allow them to be a human being without arguing or trying to teach them something, but just hearing who they are and why they are the way that they are, without judgment.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It takes a lot of patience and courage and willingness, right? I mean, and it doesn't come easy. I mean, CeCee, I hear you share what it takes, and I'm like, that's taken you years of practice to be
It's
able to do
exhausting,
that.
but most of us have family members we could start with. There are people of opposing viewpoints in our immediate family that we could go and have a totally different relationship just by being an active listener instead of reacting to the things that they're saying, even if they are outrageous. Just being an active listener and hearing, because sometimes those people say those things just for shock value. They're just trying to get around. Sometimes it's at the heart of who they are and how they understand the world. And our job is not, there's nowhere in scripture, our job is to go to someone and tell them that they're getting it all wrong, that they understood the world all wrong. And so just by listening, you're able to hear that person. And most of the time, if you're willing to listen to them, eventually they will be more trusting and they will be more curious about the things that you believe and why you believe them. But we shouldn't try to convert anybody. That's not our job.
CeCee, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
This time has been so holy to hear from you and your experience and your faithfulness through this process. I find myself having 100 more questions. I'd love to follow up with you personally. And I wonder if our students have questions too, if you're willing to share your contact information with us.
Sure.
So that they can do that. So if you give me permission, I can,
Okay.
or if you'd rather people contact you through email, just let me know that too.
Either way, it's always, because of Zoom ridiculousness, it's always better to text me before you call me, just in case, and I can tell you when's a good time to talk. But yeah, email or by phone.
Awesome. Before we reluctantly close our time in prayer, I'm wondering if you have any final comments that you'd like to make.
I just think sometimes people in a dominant culture beat themselves because they feel like they haven't done enough. But just gathering and having these types of conversation is the right thing to do. It is. The type of work that you will be involved with to help with anti-racism will become clear, but committing to this conversation is the biggest part of the work, and to stay in these types of conversations where you are talking about your journey and hearing someone else's journey.